G'day expats, welcome to another episode of Expat Chat, episode 111, triple one for you today. And as always, joined by with my friend, colleague, business mentor, and co-host, Brett Evans, who is the Managing Director of the Europe, Middle East and Africa's region. G'day Brett, how you going?
Mate, well, thanks. Well, thanks. And to the folks out there who can see on my left, your right, depending on which way you're looking at the screen, is Mr. James Ridley, who's the Managing Director for the Asia Pacific region, US specialist, as well as Asia specialist, and runs the Australian office. G'day, mate.
G'day. And how is everyone doing today? And how are you, Brett? How's the sandpit? Have those ridiculous, I feel like you've been through monsoonal season lately, all the flooding been going on over there. God.
Yeah, people forget that, we actually get rain here. And quite often actually, but not as often as say Australia and that sort of stuff. So, but obviously for the 10 days of the year that we get the rain, the place isn't designed well. So there's sandbags at the front of the villas, and watching idiots. They can't drive the best time over here, let alone when it becomes wet. It's actually quite humorous. You almost want to get an esky and a deck chair and put it on the side of the road because it
I
is
feel
quite
like,
fun to watch.
well, it's actually, that comment reminds me, you pull up to a boat ramp sometimes on the weekend. If you're ever bored and you're going to a busy boat camp, just rock up early in the morning with a
Yeah,
coffee, and you
and
just
watch
see
and
everyone
enjoy
pretty much
reversing
and just
trailers.
jackknifing. That's right. Pretty funny. If you're ever really bored and want some good fun, good clean fun, get down at a boat ramp on a
Yeah.
beautiful day. Take a couple of beers or a coffee and just have a laugh.
Yeah, watch the people try and reverse their trailers. So, mate, we'll get cracking on for the good show for the good
Yep.
folks out there today. We're going to
Yep.
talk about the actual nuts and bolts of becoming a non-resident. We've always talked
Yeah.
about it, about how to be a non-resident, resides, domicile, 183, and Commonwealth Super Test.
Hmm.
Um, this one we're going to talk about the actual process. Because people
Mm.
are still asking that process, and with so many folks coming out of Oz, certainly to the sandpit. I mean, I think the numbers I saw the other day, there's now 6,000 Aussies just in Saudi alone. So that number's grown dramatically. And
Yeah, it has.
it is a rite of passage at the moment, that's for sure. There's a freeway going between Australia and Riyadh and Neom for that matter as well too. So, mate, let's give the good folks out there a bit of context. And I will apologise. A lot of folks have been talking to over the last month saying, where's the podcast? And it's like, well, we like to have a bit of a break through January because it's the Australian long summer season. And we're back with a passion now. So every week we'll have these things banging out. And
Yep.
it's great to hear that you guys love it. It's great to hear that not just James's parents and my parents listen to it. There's actually other people out there, which is fantastic. Then we get some compliance out of the way. All the information we're going to talk about today should not be treated as personal advice, should be treated as information and educational purposes only. Please do not take this as personal advice. If you do need to get personal advice, speak to the specialist, speak to Atlas.
That's it, mate. And I mean, it's a really good question today about, I guess, what firmly makes you a non-resident or what things need to be done when you're a non-resident or at what point, how long have you been overseas? Can you declare yourself as a non-resident? That's actually probably the real big one that I see with a lot of, I suppose, up and coming expats or soon to be expats where they're like, well, how long do I have to be relocated, new country, working over there before I can nominate myself as a non-resident for tax purposes? And I mean, we've got to bear in mind we haven't really received those new rules yet in terms of modernising tax residency rules. They're still out there in the ether and waiting for the government to provide their last sort of notes on them after that consultation period last year. So who knows, we might get an update on those in the next 12 months. But we're still right now referring to the old rules, and you've got still a primary test, which is the resides test, and that's more of I guess, a statutory test, you could say. And then you've got the secondary test, which is your permanent place of abode or your domicile, I guess you'd say, the domicile test. You've got the 183-day test, and then the Commonwealth Super Test, which is mainly for Australian government employees, which is, I guess, hit and miss with expats, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think that's where the confusion lies is people are sort of reading too much into the process. And what people don't realise is essentially the way the Australian tax system works is it's based on a self-assessment. And then only after the fact does the ATO come back to you to question something, which is normally 1, 2, 3, up to 4 years. Any bonus will 4A, we know that one.
Yep.
Later. So to me, people don't realise it's you don't actually call them on the way to the airport to say, hey, James here, I'm on the way to Tullamarine or Mascot or Brisbane Airport to move overseas.
Mm.
Please make a note on your file that I'm a non-res, because it doesn't work that way. It's just sort of blends into our, the way we normally work with the ATO in terms of that tax return is not only a way for you to declare stuff, but it's also a declaration as well too.
Mm.
And
That's right.
we had a question on the our Facebook page, company page the other day, saying, how do you actually become a non-res? Like, what's the process? So let's jump straight into that, and then we can talk about the nuances after that as well too.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, first one, if we're just looking at the current rules as they are, there's 4 tests. You got the primary test, the resides test. That is the main one. And this feeds into, if you have moved overseas, this feeds into all the different things. It feeds into your habits there. Are you setting up permanent attachments for where you have relocated to? Have you got a rental apartment or house? Is your family moved over there? Have you put your family into the local school system? Private health insurance and that. It's all these habitual things. And I did say something incorrectly at the beginning of this episode. I said that the first test is a statutory test. It's actually a common law test, not a statutory test. The other 3 secondary tests, they're actually the statutory ones.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. The first one, the common law test, and it's about, I guess, maintaining a location somewhere physical and residing there permanently, but all those other habits which then feed into that and being, I suppose, cemented in that one location, which is typically going to be outside of Australian borders. But I'll say this, you need to reside somewhere permanently. If you're moved overseas, but you're jumping around and you're exploring the world and going to other countries, well, you haven't really, I suppose, set up, and you're not residing in one place at one time for a long period. You're just traveling. And that's something which has definitely caused a lot of conjecture, and people have challenged a lot of tax rulings in the past. We saw that one that was out of the Middle East in the past, which was a really big one.
Harding case out of Bahrain.
That's right. Yep. So that's a really good, I suppose, starting point. But I think it comes down to where you're residing permanently and all those habits that feed into you residing in that one location permanently as well.
I think you're spot on. And as I say to clients, and we always try to demystify the verbiage, because bearing in mind this legislation was written back in 1936 in a very old worldy kind of way.
Oh, yeah.
I say, when you're looking at the resides test, it's where do you live, work and play? If you live, work and play in one location, that's your home. If you live somewhere but work somewhere else and you play somewhere else, like it's, you're working overseas, you're not living overseas. That's where a lot of digital nomads are getting caught up these days, because they bounce in and out on 3-month or 2-month or 1-month tourist visas, being location agnostic. So technically they're a resident of nowhere, and they default to being a tax resident of Australia. So
That's right.
to me, that's the bit that really sort of causes the friction. But I'm not in Australia. Well, you need to reside somewhere. You need to have a roof over your head. You need to have a rental contract if possible, or work accommodation if that's the alternative. But you do need to have some sort of permanent place of abode. And you need to have those connections to that country. You need to have utility bills. You need to have, in my case, I've got daughters at school and all that sort of stuff. And that sort of,
well, that's it.
Blends across into that domicile test too.
And this is, and when we look at the resides test, this is what we mean by common law tests. It's all these social and living arrangements which feed into you residing there permanently. That's actually what the ATO definitely takes into account when they're deciding whether that is actually ordinary where you reside now going forward, and whether that feeds into the other secondary tests, which then feeds into you being a non-resident.
Yeah. And I think the people who get caught, and I don't like to say this the way I'm going to say it, but it's going to come out wrong, but I'm going to say it anyway. The people who get caught, for the majority of the cases, deserve to get caught, because they're sort of taking the piss. They're trying to have this world in both Australia and wherever that other location might be. And when you tell them you can't be a resident of 2 countries, you have to choose.
Yep.
They go, but I want that, but I want that. It's like, no, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can travel back to Oz for holidays and stuff like that. But as soon as you have, buying a car for that 5 or 4 months that you're in Australia, your ties to Australia are starting to increase. The links are starting to be there. And as I say to folks when they move to the sandpit, you're treated like an Emirati or a Saudi citizen when you move here. So you need to ask yourself, would an Emirati ... Would an Emirati own a jet ski in Australia? No. Get rid of the jet ski. Would an Emirati own a car in Australia? No. Get rid of the car. Would an Emirati own property in Australia? Yes, they do. They own lots of property in Australia. Would an Emirati own shares? Yes, they do. Would an Emirati vote at the election? No, they wouldn't. Take yourself off, but you're wrong. Doing those actions are a declaration by virtue of your actions that shows your intent to sabotage and become a non-resident. People who keep Australian bank accounts with Australian addresses and on the electoral roll, because it's convenient. Common law doesn't talk about convenience. It talks about actions. So to me, I think that's the one thing that sort of people miss when they are making that move overseas, especially for the first time. Or even folks who, we've met a couple of folks who are now on the second and third tours overseas. But back when they did their first tour, when they did all their research, this wasn't a real bugbear. Whereas now, in a very centralized world from a data point of view, compliance has gone from being a nice thing to have to now it's mandatory.
That's right. And I mean, if we move on to the other secondary tests, because I think we've drilled down a fair bit there on the resides test, but ultimately, if you're not setting yourself up permanently in your new location, and the ATO can look at your social and living arrangements and your family and what's going on there, and that's not all set up appropriately, then it's going to be hard pressed for you to meet the resides test. There is going to be some sort of flex because every expat situation is completely different. But that's sort of setting some minimum standards there, and that's why it is common law. It's not statutory law.
Just before you go on there, Jesh, it raised a very good point that gets asked 1 in 2, 1 in 3 meetings that I'm having anyway. And normally it's the husband goes overseas or the wife goes overseas to set things up, and then the husband or wife with the kids follow after.
Trailing spouse.
Yeah, and it causes a lot of friction because does that mean if I move, I can't declare myself as a non-res until my wife moves or my husband moves? So there's all that, and I just want to sort of put it on the record to say no. You can actually have separate non-residency dates as long as over the course of the next 2 years in substantiating those tests, the resides, domicile, 183 and Commonwealth Super, that you pass those tests. You fail those tests, I should say. You've got to fail those tests. So, as long as you fail those tests over a successive period, the fact that you might have a different date by, say, 6 months with your wife or spouse or partner, whoever it might be, is okay. But people think because their partner hasn't moved over, that they're not a non-res either. So just want to put it out there. There's a lot of urban myths going on right now that talk about those sort of situations.
Yeah, that's right. And we can do that on the reverse as well, coming back, those sort of things, but won't drill into it today. I mean, next tests are the statutory tests, the secondary tests. And again, we're looking at the current legislation as it is right now, and that's the domicile test. And then you've got the 183 day test. And then lastly, you have the Commonwealth Super test. Commonwealth Super is probably actually a really quick and easy one to address. If you are an Australian government employee that's been seconded overseas and you are still receiving contributions to your Australian government super, the flat rule there generally is that you're going to mainly be continuing to be an Australian tax resident. And it's just because you're on a secondment generally. There's not really much flex or change around that. Often when I think about that, I think about the army, military, those sort of things, where
Diplomats,
you might be stationed somewhere. Exactly right. So often their tax residency stays intact. When we look at the other secondary tests, so the domicile test, the one thing that comes to mind there is a permanent place of abode, a home, where you rest your hat when you finish your workday.
Yeah, it really is about where's the centre of your universe. If I was living in Dubai, but my wife and daughters and dog was back in Australia, I'm working in Dubai, but am I living in Dubai? Two very big differences. Essentially my ties are back to Oz. Whereas with everyone being here, I go home from work, kiss the wife, talk to the kids about their school. It's here. We're not in a sense of temporary stasis, I guess you could say. and it's very
That's
much
right.
about that. The exception to that, and this is becoming more and more of an issue, which is why I'm actually glad the new residency rules are coming through that will really be very prescriptive on this, is when you move to a location, but due to the circumstances of the location, your partner, spouse, and or children can't move with you, there's that disconnect between the two. And that's where the answer is not an automatic no. There might be mitigating circumstances as to why they can't move. That's not their choice not to move.
Mm.
And in those sort of situations, I always recommend having a chat to an accountant to either get a tax determination or some sort of deep dive into your situation to substantiate the why. It doesn't mean
That's right.
you are automatically treated as a non-resident. I mean, NEOM's a classic example right now. NEOM, they've only got a couple of accommodation. They haven't got family accommodation. So there's a lot of displaced families because they've got to wait for the new building to be built. So there's an intention to move, but at the moment
Mm.
they can't because the physicality doesn't exist of that accommodation. So
That's right.
you need to speak to someone who understands the grey space on that side of it because it's not just an automatic, yeah, you're moving to NEOM, you're a tax resident. It's more to that. So, and that's
Yeah.
why that
Yeah.
domicile test is unworkable in the current scenario because when they wrote the laws of tax residency back in 1936, the current working environment didn't exist. Back in those days, we virtually put our clothes into a trunk, jumped on a steamer ship and went overseas.
Yeah.
That's the last time it happened. We didn't fly.
Yeah.
Whereas now, we're jetting back and forth, left, right, and centre. So
Yep.
the new rules will certainly make that a lot easier to manage.
Yep.
But there will be some other bits as well too, which we'll talk about in another episode that are a bit of a
That's
handbrake.
it. Oh yeah, there's some that can be quite punitive, to be honest, when a DTA isn't in place. But the next secondary test, the last one, the 183-day test, and essentially identifying, are you in Australia for more than 183 days in the same financial year? Yes or no? That's another secondary test. Um, and that's probably the clearest test that we probably have out of the secondary test, if we're being honest, a fixed straight line there, 183 days. But what's interesting about that is, technically speaking, I could still be in Australia for 200 days and then head overseas, but I can still deem my non-residency to end as of the date that I left.
Yeah.
So there is actually a carve out for the fact that you are ceasing residency at a particular date. But if we sort of extrapolate the 183 days and we work that across, say, over the 3 financial years, if you're running a very close line there of in and out of Australia for 182 days and then overseas for 184 days, I would say the ATO would look at that and go, hang on, I can see here that why the hell are you in Australia for 6 months or nearly 6 months each year for the last 3 years? You'd probably trigger an audit and it'd be a case where they would probably identify you as an Australian tracked resident based on your movements in and out of Australia. You can go back to the reside test. You're not really residing anywhere permanently, are you? You're moving back and forth pretty quickly. And then it's going back to the whole domicile test. If you're keeping the family in Australia based on that example, well, very likely the ATO would find that your domicile is actually in Australia. Secondary
Yeah.
test, Australian tax
Spot on.
resident. See where I'm going with this.
I'm glad you mentioned that because a lot of folks, you see in social media land, people saying, make sure you leave before 31st of December if you're about to become an expat because otherwise you don't want to trigger the 183-day rule. You can
Yeah.
leave Australia on the 1st of June, with 1 month to go, and you'll be treated as a non-resident from the 1st of June to the 30th of June. When it comes to that 183-day test, it's about the quantum of your time overseas, not while you're in Australia when it comes to considering all the moving parts of qualifying. So that 183-day test is for people who are overseas, who are in that financial year, full financial year, spending those time. And look, Aussies love to take the piss and they love to take the mickey out of scenarios, and she'll be right, apparently is the strategy. And I know people who will try and tread that line as much as possible. I'm like, why do it?
Yeah.
And I said to someone the other day, brace for an audit. And they go, really? It's like, you are flirting, and there weren't 182 days. It was like still 170. So it's pretty close.
No.
And I was like,
I mean,
why?
I've had calls with choice words, some time wasters, and they're essentially saying, no, I want to be a tax resident of no country. How do I do that? It's like, is that a thing?
Yeah.
I mean, if it was, we would have already done it, wouldn't we? And
Mhm.
then they think they're being clever by trying to outsmart tax systems. I mean, the world's becoming a very small place. That's not actually something that even exists. You can be a tax resident of a tax-free country. That's great, but you still need to set yourself up appropriately so you're
Yeah.
meeting those tests. Being a tax resident of no country, that's not a thing.
No. And look, under the new rules, and look, we won't go too much into detail, it does become a possibility, but you still, from the other country's point of view, you have to have somewhere to live anyway, permanently. You might be out of Australia's clutches, go, great, no more ATO.
Yeah,
But are you in someone else's clutches? So,
that's it.
frying
Yeah,
pan to the fire. So as James said, you do need to be resident somewhere. Otherwise, unless you've just got cash and you're just floating around the world having a holiday, then you don't need to be resident somewhere. You can just do what you want. But
that's right.
most people who move overseas are actually working, earning an income. And when you're
Mm,
doing that, someone wants a piece of that. And
yeah,
whether it's tax or VAT or fees or something, everyone's got their own way
yeah,
of getting some money out of you. But you need to pay the piper somewhere. Um,
that's right.
let's run through just quickly, because this is a question I get often asked about the mechanics of that declaration of being a non-resident. A lot of folks don't realise it's all done after the fact. Like I said, you don't get on the phone to the ATO on the way to the airport and say it. And what a lot of
Yeah,
folks don't realise is that when you do this is why the tax return in your year of departure is probably your most important tax return you'll ever do as an expat, because it's your communication tool to the ATO. And by
yeah,
that, I mean, there's a section there when you do your tax return that you never would have seen in the past because it never related to you. But there's a section that says, did you become a non-resident for tax purposes in this financial year? You tick that box, you put that date of departure, if that's the date you want to choose to be your non-residency start date. And that's a heads up to the ATO to say, hey, I'm off, see you later. And if I do earn Australian sourced income, there'll be further returns to come in the successive years.
mm,
But that's how simple it is, because they take that now,
mm.
they go, okay, rightio, you know, and a lot of folks, and I meet people who are 7, 8, 10 years behind in their tax returns, and they miss that one from
Oh, it's
the year of
it
departure.
is. That's right, and it's pretty crucial. Because again, you are finally sort of crystallizing the fact that you're going to be a non-resident, but it's also a case, if you've been overseas for 8 or 9 years and you left, you know, in April, you're you're not going to remember what your tax deductions were, what was going on back then, interest, trying to track down statements of an old mortgage, all those sort of things. So it does become a bit of a project for your accountant, but it's also the year in which you're telling the ATO what's going on. So that
Yeah,
way you're not going to have to be worried about any funny letters of the ATO going, hey, you got 10 years worth of overdue tax
outstanding.
returns. Where you been? You got a HEX debt. Where's that? Where we haven't received a repayment in 10 years. Let's throw some
Yeah,
general interest charges on those. Um, so those are the things in order to get organized. One other question I often get around residency is, well, how long do I have to be overseas for me to think I'm a non-resident? Well, we went through the residency just then, but I mean, if someone came to me and said, I'm only going to be overseas for 12 months, I'll be like, great, you're very likely going to be an Australian tax resident still. That sounds like a secondment.
yeah,
That's a very brief contract. But then if you're going over and you do 1 year and then you get another 1 year and then you get another 1 year contract, then that, adds up to three. And that's a case where you likely would be a non-resident if you're meeting all those other tests that we just ran through. But if you're only going to be overseas for 12 to 18 months, usually even up to 2 years, to be honest, I think most accountants would feel pretty hard pressed to declare you as a non-resident for such a short period.
yeah, I totally agree. I think the only time I've seen it be argued the other way is when your return to Australia is outside of your control. COVID
That's
was a
right.
classic example.
Yep.
People moved
Oh yeah.
overseas. 12 months later, they lost their jobs. They had to move back to Australia. So it wasn't their choice. It wasn't their doing. It was an external scenario. It might be sick family member. You might be sick. So in those sort of cases, there is that flexibility to argue the point to say that, no, you were a non-resident for 12, 18 months
Mm,
because of that scenario. But certainly when it comes to shipping, the light fantastic when it comes to, pulling up clients and traveling around, the
mhm.
12-month mark, is a deal killer, even 18 months. I say to everyone, put in your calendar when you jump on that plane, 2 years and one day. That's when you start considering whether you are going to move back to
Mm.
Australia. because don't even consider it before, and especially if you're in a country like the Middle East where there's no taxes and no DTAs to protect you. That time in the sandpit could be a very expensive exercise if you do return early.
Oh, yeah. And usually people spend their money pretty quickly, so they're not going to have thousands and thousands of dollars saved up for tax owing to the
Not at
ATO.
all. Not at all. Not at all. So, and I think that's the other thing too, that, the biggest questions that we often get when it comes to that coming out of that scenario is, what else? And it's like, well, you do what you think is right. Remove yourself in an electoral role, sell cars, sell assets that are lifestyle assets, not investment assets. And then you hope. And this is why the new rules, the current rules don't work well, because it's like you just hope that you never get the tap on the shoulder to substantiate why that's the case. Murphy's Law always says if you don't do things right, you will get that tap on the shoulder. But the ATO is very connected digitally, but not that good yet. They can't sort of read your brainwaves and know that you're lying. But not yet anyway, not yet. But to me, it's a matter of, if you do things right from the start, keep that, put a bow on it, make it nice and neat, good 1 month life admin in the lead up to that move, take care of everything, don't leave things to chance. And then when you do your tax return post 1 July of that financial year, you make that declaration and that's it. There's actually not a lot to it, but you just need to make sure that in the lead up to that declaration, all your actions are mapping to that declaration. You don't want to be sitting there, even if it's honest, and say, oh, I'm sorry, you're blubbering and you're sort of confused. You just got to look like you're dodgy. Whereas if you just show everything, it's nice and neat, lined up like ducks, it makes it easy.
Absolutely, mate. Absolutely. And that's probably a good point to stop there today. Residency rules.
We'll leave it there. Lots going on coming up, guys. So keep an eye on our events page on our website. I'll put a link down below. Obviously, thanks for all the folks on the Facebook group for all your participation. There'll be a link down below as well. First call out of the year, guys. Love some reviews, love some ratings as well too. So please give us a bit of love there. We're obviously trying to make this year a big year when it comes to getting out there. Looking at the numbers over the Christmas break, we're now into over 100 countries, which is great. It means we're helping expats in over 100 countries do the right thing by managing their finances. So, but the more you can help us, the bigger that voice will be. As I said, we don't charge for this. This is all free of charge for you guys. And we want to keep it that way. But, we're not vain, but we do like to see that we're making a difference. Because it's time that we don't necessarily have to give away. So we're sort of being very prescriptive with this time, just to help people where we can. And if all we ask from repayment for that is just a couple of reviews, a couple of subscriptions, can't even talk, and also
couple of thumbs ups.
Some thumbs ups would be fantastic. So I'll leave there for the good folks, and we'll see you on the next episode, 112.
Sounds good, mate. Thanks for tuning in today, guys. And Brett, see you on the next episode.
Thanks, mate. Take care.